Hello, we are back. I'm back on the channel. It's been a long time since I actually recorded a video, but that is because I am now unofficially Dr. Jules. I'm still like not used to this, but I did pass my PhD Viva / thesis defense, depending on what you call it, which technically means that I have got over the last big hurdle to getting my PhD. Now I've still got like a few little corrections to make on my thesis, but I am now on the road to getting my PhD. And I thought today what I would share in a video is how I prepped for the PhD Viva, because I did some things which I think now, on hindsight, in retrospect, were really beneficial, and there were other things which I was like, why did I do that? That was a waste of time. So I thought, while it's still fresh in my head, put it all into a video about how I prepped for my Viva, and yeah, let's go. Now, everyone's Viva experience is different, and this is more me reflecting on like what I think was useful that I did and what wasn't useful. So take all of this like with a pinch of salt and thinking about your own university, speak to your supervisors so you know what to expect more so for your individual experience, but hopefully some of these things can like help you on your way. So my preparation was interesting because I only found out that I had my Viva 3 weeks before the actual exam, which is quite a short time, but I got through it. The first thing that I did was to read the requirements on my university's website about like what to expect from a Viva, because, well, first and foremost, I was like, have I forgotten anything? Like, is there some other form or some other thing I need to bring with me to this Viva, and I'm gonna turn up and they're gonna be like, Soz, you can't do it because you haven't read the website, because, you know, why wouldn't you read the website, you silly fool? So I wanted to read it to check for the more administrative purposes, but on my uni website, it also says, these are the requirements for a Viva, this is what you're expected to do. And so reading these requirements actually made me feel a bit better about like knowing how I should prepare for the exam. So in essence, the guidelines from my university told me that I need to be able to read my thesis and poke holes in it. I need to be able to go through that thesis and be like, that's a weakness, that's a limitation, and really be able to like criticize my own work and also criticize work in the field as well. So like on the whole, where in the field are the weak spots and what do we need to sort of iron out. I also needed to be clear on how my work was adding to or challenging the field, and then also to know the most up-to-date like viewpoints and overall results from the field in general that I'm in, which for me was something that I had to do a bit of work on because I've been working for like 6 months. So I felt a bit like out of the zone with that sort of thing. So really just brushing up on what's been published recently and where is the field right now and where are we going to. So yeah, reading the university website was like a good thing to do at the start of the whole revision period. A definite do was to make a list of like my thesis from start to finish. I do this in Notion. I made like a checklist of like every chapter, all the subheadings in those chapters. So as I was reading through the thesis, I could tick off where I was up to. With a thesis, it's so long. Mine was like 339 pages or something. So if you're just reading it, the days can just feel like endless and you can be like, I'm never gonna get to the end of this. So for me, I split up my reading into like, you know, chapter 2, section 4, like little sections where I was reading 10, 20 pages at a time, and then I could tick it off as I went, and it just made the days much easier to handle because I could plan more so what I wanted to do that day. A definite do for me was getting that overall picture of what is going on in my field of research and what has been happening since I skiddled on out of science into a communication-based role, because I haven't been keeping on top of the literature as I would have done if I'd been in the lab. When I'm in the lab, people are talking about papers all the time. Did you read this? I'll send you this. And that you're sort of out of that environment. So I could have missed things that were important. So what I decided to do was, firstly, I was like, I'll go and look at like big news stories in Alzheimer's disease research, because That's what my thesis was on. There is a fab website if you are an Alzheimer's disease dementia researcher called ALS Forum. The news section on that website is a godsend because the summaries of the papers they have on there are so in-depth and they cover like the really big milestones that have been happening in the field. So what I did was I went from September this year and went back to September last year and essentially copied and pasted all of the links from the relevant news stories into my reference spreadsheet document, just copied them all in, because then I was like, if I read those news stories, I'll have a really good overview of what's happening in my little area of Alzheimer's disease research. I also went and looked for, reviews of topics in my field. I also went to PubMed to find new primary publications in my area as well. I just used keywords to do this, so just searched lots of different keywords, organized by date. So again, I had like the 2021 papers first and went back to like September 2020 just to check I hadn't missed anything. My lit review, I had papers in there probably up until February 2021. So just to make sure, and literally just scrolled through anything that was relevant, copied it into my spreadsheet. But what I would say is a big don't here for me, a big don't is to not stress about the ins and outs of all these new papers. I copied in like news stories, reviews, papers, like 30 new things that I was like, oh, I should read that. And then I was like, hang on a minute, when am I reading 30 papers like in depth when I've got like 2 and a bit weeks till my exam? And some things I was getting really down in the details in. And in my exam, I didn't get asked anything about new literature. I got asked some like broad questions about the field, and it was nice to have some backup in my head of like some of the new results that had come out, but I didn't go into them in detail. So I would suggest, for me, I read the news articles, that was well enough. Like even just skimming them would have been enough just to get that overall picture, and reading like a few of the papers, but not stressing out too much about the real details. But something that I wish I would have maybe spent a little bit more time on, so a definite do, is to read any papers you've put in your lit review that your examiners are authors on, because my examiners spoke about their work and they especially referenced papers that I'd spoken about in my lit review, and I did not prioritize those papers. I just thought I need to go over the key papers in my field and the key results and new results, and I didn't really think of like, I'm gonna have 2 people here who I'm talking a bit about their work, and if they start speaking about their papers, I need to know what they've done. So I would have spent maybe a little bit more time just looking for those references where my examiners are actual like first authors on, and reading them so I know the overall like results that they found in a little bit more detail than what I'd written in my thesis. This was something that really stressed me out. So a big don't is to not pick apart every single thing in the thesis. Like you will not sleep. You will be really, really stressed out if you're going through line by line and thinking, what could they say about that? What could they say about this? I like to think of it now, like with the exam behind me, they were never that specific about certain like lines or, certain little things. The questions I got were quite broad. So think of your like thesis as a paper that's not yours, that you're reviewing, and think, okay, what are the main questions that I would ask about that section of work, rather than going through like line by line like I was doing and being really specific and then being like, oh my God, I don't know how I'd answer that. I don't know anything about that. When in reality, like it's so rare for the examiners to be that specific. Well, in my experience, they just were not that specific. They were just a lot more general overview questions and more like, why do you think that happened? Why do you think you got that result? Rather than really like teasing all the little details out. You just don't have the time. A Viva is like 3 hours in the UK. So I wish I'd just zoomed out a bit more and remembered that the examiners are not as much in the weeds with the thesis as I am. Something that I'm glad I did and is a do, is to be clear on the limitations of my work and also very honest about what I could have done better. I think the examiners are really looking for that. They were looking for me to essentially say, yeah, I did something like this, But on reflection, I now know I could have done it a little bit differently, which would have potentially been better. You know, I did some of this work 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm a very different like scientist now compared to what I was then. So being very honest and saying, I did this way because I had a reason why I did everything in that thesis, even if the reason now I can see maybe wasn't the best reason. And then saying, but now I'd maybe do it a little bit differently and explain how you would improve that. So the examiners are looking for you to be like critical of your own work and reflect back and think, how could you improve it? And I think that was really nice in my exam to have those conversations with the examiners and me being honest instead of being very defensive of limitations and trying to just like stand my ground and be like, this is why I did this, and failing to sort of see how things could be improved. Like that would have not served me well in that exam. Definitely not. I went through my thesis, and as I was going through it, I was writing notes on how I could improve certain things as I went. And for me, it was just nice in the exam. Like obviously not all of those things came up, but some of them did, and I'd already like thought about it already. A don't for me was to not stress too much about all the finer details of like the background science. I went through my thesis, and whenever I came across something that I was a bit unsure about, or I was like, ooh, I sort of know that, but if they asked me a question on it, I might fluff a little bit, I wrote it into a list. And that list ended up being extremely long. I went through and wrote about things like science that I hadn't done since undergrad biology. So for example, I ended up going down a very deep wormhole of studying mRNA splicing, which I did not need to do. I didn't do anything to do with that for my thesis, so they weren't gonna ask me about it. And if they did, it would have been very surface level, which I already knew. I also ended up down a hole of like chemistry, and again, haven't done chemistry really since undergrad, with reagents and like being like, why is that in that buffer? Which I think you can get in like one sentence, whereas I was going down to the molecular level and trying to see how different reagents work together. So unnecessary. I wish I had just had that list of things. I think that was useful, but spending no more than 5 minutes on each one, going through and just getting a sentence together of like, if I get asked that, what sentence would I say? If I get asked that, do I know the top line information I need to know? Rather than spending days and days and days, like really going deep with those things, which I didn't get asked a single thing about reagents and buffers, nothing at all. And you might get asked that in a Viva, but you can cover it with like a sentence. You're not gonna need to know the ins and outs of like how different chemical bonds replace each other in a buffer. Something that I'm very glad I've done now is, as I was going through my thesis, I kept a list of all the things that I think I should change. Now you could do this maybe as like track changes in a Word document. That probably would have been better, but I had a PDF. So I just made a list of, you know, little spelling mistakes or plurals that I put in there, or grammatical errors or formatting errors. I found out like 3 days before my exam that I'd somehow, the whole document had glitched and there were 2 figure 23s in my document, which meant that my figures were all labeled wrong after that point, and I had 71 figures, and the in-text figure references were not matching up to the right figure. So that was good, but I didn't get stressed about it, because at the end of the day, the thesis you take into the Viva is a draft. That was a very nice, calming statement of, this is still a draft, it's fine. So I wrote down all of the things that I want to go through myself and change. And when I get the examiner's corrections, I'll just like combine those together into a list and tackle them all chronologically as I go through. But I'm glad that I did that now. So when I'm going through it again, I'm not having to look for all of the little mistakes. I've already like got them all down. And there are a lot of them. And the biggest don't of them all, and I think this hit me about 2 days before my actual exam, was to not forget like what this is all about. The Viva for a PhD is like the last little 2% of the whole degree. And I was like really stressed out about this Viva, and I was like, hang on a minute, Julia, you've done like 98% of the work. You've done all the data collection, you've like been through all the hard times of optimizing things, making things work, all the stress of all of that. You've written the thesis. This is the last tiny thing. And if you can get through all of that stuff, you can do the Viva. And I think also just reflecting on like what my PhD degree was all about. It's so easy to get bogged down and think of like a PhD about the results and be really like results focused, because obviously that is important. But I think also like this is the end of 4 years of I've had really great times, really hard times. I've grown a lot as a person. My whole research like motivation was for my family who've had Alzheimer's disease, and trying to keep that in mind was like, it kept me a lot calmer. Just think of it as like the last tiny bit and like you've done most of the work like already. And just enjoy it. Like it's a chance for you to talk about your work with 2 people who have to read it, they have to, and they're not in your department, so they've not seen it before. And I was like, that's actually like really nice. And I took that sort of attitude into the exam, and it ended up just being a really lovely, hard, difficult, like not difficult in the sense of like I felt under threat, more like challenging intellectual conversation with 2 world-leading experts. Like that is actually pretty amazing. An absolute must for me was to look after myself and make sure that I was still like healthy and not running myself into the ground, because I would not have been able to speak for 3 hours had I not had my proper sleep, been eating properly and been exercising. I wouldn't have been able to hold that conversation. So looking after myself was like one of the best things that I could do in that run-up. So pretty much that's how I prepared. I would say the biggest things are to read the thesis and think like a reviewer. What questions would you ask if this wasn't your work? To also consider those big questions in the field and think, how does your work relate into them? Acknowledge the limitations in the thesis. There are going to be limitations. Be critical of your own work. That's what the examiners want to see. And also bring a solution to that criticism as well. If you have a limitation, what would you do differently? Don't just be like, this wasn't good, and then not have anything else to say. So limitations, but also a solution to the limitations, or what you could do next. And then think about the future of the work, like where is it going to go next? And I would also say to just be honest, relax, take a deep breath, give yourself time to think and enjoy it. Like enjoy the experience, because I definitely was not thinking like that in the run-up, and I wish I'd just said to myself, just enjoy it. But thank you so much for watching this video. And also if you want some like neuroscience-based productivity tips and to just know more about your brain so you can just be like, yes, the brain is cool, then subscribe to the channel and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.